today featuring One Work, Five Questions. The aim of the show is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, to disclose the man behind his many spectacular deeds: the Declaration of Independence, the Bill for Religious Freedom, the University of Virginia. We aim especially to steer clear of and often debunk the scurrilous narratives of today's Jeffersonian revisionists and to offer instead a depiction of Jefferson based on traditional fact following methods, not immune to incommodious evidence and answerable to, not oblivious of, the criticism of other scholars. I'm your host, George Gorey, formerly a captain from the California Highway Patrol and currently a
Second
criminal
time you couldn't get
investigator.
your last name right, Last show, same thing.
That's right. Currently a criminal investigator with the local district attorney's office in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. H is a professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University Camden. He is author, editor of some 75 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority, which I happen to agree with, in my humble opinion, and has published over 350 essays, formal and informal, and has 31 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes about Ukraine. Today, we look at a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Benjamin Banneker. Banneker writes to Thomas Jefferson about the plight of blacks in America. He sends to Jefferson a handwritten copy of his almanac, published in 1791. Before we begin, let us address questions from a young maven.
Hi, I'm Maxwell, and I watch the Thomas Jefferson show. What is that song you always hear all the time?
So, what is that song that we hear all the time? That is the Thomas Jefferson Breakdown.
All right, before we get started with our questions, let's do I'm going to read a little brief biography of Benjamin Banneker. He was born on November 9th, 1791, passing away on October 19th, 1806. He was an American naturalist, mathematician, astronomer, and almanac author.
And most importantly, an African-American freed slave.
African-American. Freed slave. He was a landowner and he worked as a surveyor and a farmer. He was born in Baltimore to a free African-American mother and a father who had formerly been enslaved. He had little or no formal education, was largely self-taught, and became known for assisting Major Andrew Ellicott in a survey that established the original borders of the District of Columbia, the federal capital of the United States. His knowledge of astronomy helped him author a commercially successful series of almanacs, and he corresponded with Thomas Jefferson on topics of slavery, racial equality, and advocates of racial equality throughout the 19th century. Abolitionists praised his works and promoted him. Although a fire on the day of his funeral destroyed many of his papers and belongings, one of his journals and several of his artifacts survived. He has become a folk hero after his death, leading to many accounts of his life being exaggerated or embellished. The names of parks, schools, and streets commemorate him and his works to this day, as do other tributes. So now that we have a little brief history, let's get on with our question number 2. Let us begin with a look at the short letter. What stands out?
Well, bring up the letter. I try to bring it up while you're talking, and let's just read it. It's a very short letter.
Yeah, this is
and
Thomas
what's
Jefferson
interesting,
Banneker, right?
Yeah. He says, I thank you for your letter of the 19th instant and for the almanac it contained. Nobody wishes more than I to see such proof as you exhibit. One, that nature has given, I put the numbers in myself, to our black brethren, talents equal to those of other colors of men. And two, that the appearance or want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence, both in Africa and America. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition both of their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence. Imbecility doesn't mean, as we mean it today, the stupidness. It's more probably understood as degradation, as the imbecility of the present existence and other circumstances which cannot be neglected. I will admit. Now, he mentions that he's going to send a copy of the almanac. Banneker wrote him in a previous letter. It's a very long letter. I'll talk about that in a bit. And appealed to Thomas Jefferson as a man of a sort of liberal mind to look at the almanac and do what he can on behalf of African Americans to have them to end the institution of slavery and have them being treated civilly, just like all Europeans are, and so forth. So he says, I'm going to send your almanac to Monsieur de Condorcet in Paris. Condorcet was a friend of Monsieur de Condorcet. He was a friend of Jefferson in Paris. He fought in the Revolutionary War from France's part, helping the colonists and so forth. And yeah, so he does that. And we'll close this up for now. We'll get back to the okay. I mean, when you look at that, what we see is Jefferson talking about the degraded condition of African Americans, talking about his desire to see things better for African Americans and so forth. But he does talk about the degraded condition of their existence in African America. He talks about raising condition, both the body and their mind. He says in Query 6 in Notes on Virginia, where he's talking about the minerals, vegetables, and animals, and he includes Native Americans there, but later on in Laws, he talks about, Query 14, he talks about African Americans. Doesn't include them in 6 because they're not part of the continent. They were brought there. And he studies African Americans. He's made them an object of study insofar as he has any kind of an expert opinion, which he says he doesn't. So he does think that they are, in some sense, inferior in, he at least mentions the possibility of inferior color, that black is a color that doesn't allow for a lot of expression or animation because of its dark color. And he talks about the inferiority of Africans in both mind and imagination. So that's what we can say about that. So, I mean, that's what the letter says. And, what this bespeaks, and here's the tension for Jefferson. If you have any comments, let you know. There's this problem of nature and nurture. And he's committed by observing blacks to the notion that they're inferior by nature. He says, I'll read a couple of quotes in Notes on Virginia that pertains, and this is Query 14. And this is one of his sort of sloppier comments. He says, the improvement of blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites has been observed by everyone, and proves that their inferiority is not the effect merely of their condition of life. That's a very strong statement. And I'm not here to criticize him, right? From today's perspective, but it's a very strong statement that points in the direction that the degraded condition is natural, right? It's not something that's environmentally caused. It's not something by introduction of putting black people in a different environment, things are going to change. And let me put the late on here for me. He says a little bit later on, he talks about notwithstanding these and other discouraging circumstances among the Romans. He's talking about the Roman slaves. Their slaves were often their rarest artists. They excelled too in science, insomuch as to be usually employed as tutors to their master's children. Epictetus, Diogenes, Phaedon, Terence, and Phaedrus were slaves, but they were of the race of whites. It's not their condition then, but their nature, which has approved this distinction. So I think here, I'm not trying to analyze this from a modern perspective at all. I'm trying to understand how Jefferson might have come to this conclusion. And I think this argument has not been given due consideration. Jefferson notes that black people have been in the continent, hanging around whites and so forth, and have not picked up on a lot of on the science, on the artistry, and so forth and so on. He thinks this is an argument for nature, that they are deficient in nature. Now, if they're deficient in nature, this is not an easily remedied situation, right? And this is not a situation you want to fix by intermixing. He thought Native Americans could intermix because he thought they weren't deficient in intellect and imagination by nature. We'll talk about that a little later. Now, is it nurture? Is it environment? Now, this is a situation that is fixable by intermixing, by improving the environment. But I tried to give a couple passages that suggest strongly he doesn't think that that's the case by his own observations. Now, he's going to say in Notes on Virginia that, my observations are biased and limited in number. So he's not the final word on the subject, right? People sometimes take that as his wishy-washiness. No, it's not. It's his empiricism. He's looking at a finite set of observations. He notices the observations are biased because they're done in his own neck of the woods. So it's not really scientifically done. The problem with nature is that odds with his deism. Now, deism is the view that God created the world, and that's it. And the world, exists, persists thereafter without divine intervention. Theism is that God created the world, then he comes back periodically and intervenes, to fix its defects, like Jesus coming down to earth because humans are behaving sinfully and so forth. Jefferson, following Bolingbroke, thought theism was unattractive because he thought very much of the powers of God, that God, when he created the world, got it right, did not have to come in and fix things. Like a house builder, you build a house and over time it needs fixing because of the inferiority of the materials being used in building a house and the inferiority of the designers and builders. So this was a tension that he played with all of his life and he never remedied. I think he really was committed to a natural inferiority for African Americans for the most part, with reservations, but that was at odds with his deism. And if it was, and another problem is if African Americans by nature were deficient, then it could be that God created them separately. A lot of people thought that was the case. A lot of people who believed that African Americans were inferior thought that God might have created them separately. So if we have separate creations, again, we have two different times where God is playing around with the world. One where he created human beings, then he created black human beings. So that argues against his deism. So we have some problems there.
And you make a good point about his empiricism and his scientific thought that, he's portrayed, and we'll get into this in one of the other questions. He is portrayed now by modern scholars and a lot of progressive activists as a quote unquote racist and a hater and all this other stuff. When in reality, when you look at it, he looks at the topic quite dispassionately. And you're right, he's torn between his deism, right, and his empiricism. He's torn between these things, nature and nurture. But at the same time, he does appear to view it quite dispassionately in the sense that he leaves, and I know you're going to probably get into this, he leaves an opening for being wrong.
You have to as a scientist, because scientists do not prove anything. Science is essentially, in spite of what Popper said, Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, whom I studied extensively, it's not a deductive enterprise. It's inductive. You gather information and you frame, either you start with a hypothesis, or once enough information is gathered, you generate a hypothesis. And smoking, for example, like I'm doing, causes cancer. And that's hypothesis has been confirmed by decades and decades and decades long of information. Right? Now, if it turns out, for example, that at some point, decades from now, we find out that people smoke heavily, wind up retarding cancer. Right? We have to change our hypothesis. So science is always an open-ended enterprise.
All right, well, let's bring us to our third question here. Thomas Jefferson's letter is, of course, in reply to a letter from Benjamin Banneker. Do you have any comments on Benjamin Banneker's letter?
Well, Banneker writes a very extensive letter and a long letter, and he's appealing to Jefferson to sort of help us. He wants to show him his almanac. And an almanac is a very extraordinary achievement. Here's the almanac. He tried to get it published on several occasions and failed. Why that is the case, I don't know. I've done some research on this the other day, and finally gets printed at some point, but it gets printed with the help from some of his friends. And this is the cover here. And here we have the inner flap, Banneker's Almanac, ephemeris for the year of our Lord, 1793. And so forth. Motions of the sun and the moon, the true places, aspects of the planets, the rising, setting of the suns, rising, setting, and southing of the moon, the lunations, conjunctions, and eclipses, talking about planets and so forth, and talking about the fixed stars. This is an extraordinarily difficult Enterprise.
Yes.
And so it's a veritable feather in his cap. So he writes
Quite an
this letter.
accomplishment.
Yeah, and the question is, to what extent was it done entirely exclusively by Banneker?
Thomas Jefferson is most often called, I'm going to put in quotes, a racist and a promoter of Black inferiority. He appears to be approaching this subject of their intellect abilities in a scientific manner and not that of an uninformed, quote unquote, racist. Is this true, Colonel?
Well, I agree with what you said. I mean, Jefferson always approaches everything with dispassion. And by dispassion, disinterest. Disinterest does not mean uninterest. Uninterest means I don't care about it.
Right.
Disinterest means I care about it, but I leave my emotions out of it stoically so I can make proper decisions by not having my emotions involved. A fairly difficult scenario for Jefferson because morality was emotional, not intellectual for Jefferson. So, moral considerations would force Jefferson to be interested in issues like this in the first place, even though once he's interested in them for moral considerations, morality leaves out and it's a matter of reason coming in. I'll read you something that the Princeton University Press editors write of Jefferson on this issue. The history of Jefferson's changing attitudes towards Banneker reflects in miniature the contradiction in his views on vexing issues of slavery and race in America. There's no contradiction in his views. I mean, first off, people always use this word the wrong way. The contradiction is X and not X at the same time, right? It's snowing in Flint, Michigan, and while it's snowing, it's not snowing. And that doesn't mean, well, it's sort of snowing in one way, another way it's not. That's different. It just means someone's asserting it's snowing and someone says, no, it's not snowing. And we conjoin those with an and in one sense, and we create a logically impossible state. Jefferson did not assert, people do not assert contradictions. What Jefferson was asserting is that much evidence points to the view that Blacks are naturally defective. And there's other evidence that suggests that that's not a good hypothesis, namely if you're committed to deism, that God created the world once and you have to make separate creations, doesn't have to intervene, and in which case that's an argument against Blacks being different from nature. It's nurture, it's circumstances alone, right? So Jefferson was vexed and he was confused. He was at 6s and 7s over this issue in terms of how to resolve it, and he never did resolve it. That doesn't mean he held contradictions. As revealed primarily in his notes on Virginia, Jefferson firmly believed that slavery was a violation of natural rights of men and hoped for its abolition. Correct. He was equally convinced that Blacks and whites could not peacefully coexist in freedom because of certain natural distinctions between them, such as color, temperament, and above all, I italicize this, intellectual ability. No, that's not right. You and I talked about this on another show, right? The 4 reasons he gives is that the abuses that Blacks have suffered at the hands of whites, the sort of ill-temperedness by the white people who get used to behaving in abusive ways. People have been consistently abused and beaten and subdued, and the numbers are equal, they're likely not going to be able to get along.
There'll be long memories of this mistreatment and abuse.
Yes,
that's what he's getting at.
Yes, and Jefferson is principally blaming the white people here, not the Black people for anything. Because he was convinced that no one should be in a position of superiority and inferiority, in spite of the fact that if people X are intellectually inferior to people Y, that's not a reason for treating one group of people treating the other abusively as less than human. He was equally convinced, he therefore argued that emancipation must be accompanied by colonization of the freed slaves beyond the limits of the United States. As I read before, he thought in every instance when Black and white blood mix, the offspring is inferior to the white, right? He says in each and every instance. Well, that's a ridiculous claim, because even if Black people wind up being, in some sense, intellectually inferior, It's not going to be in each and every instance you're going to see inferior offspring. Why he says that's really kind of a stupid claim. In a widely read discussion that sets the terms of debate on this issue in America for a decade to come, Jefferson oscillated between ascribing Black intellectual inferiority to the workings of nature and attributing it to the impact of slavery. That's true. Though at times he virtually suggested, I don't know what it means, virtually suggested. Is that different from suggested? To suggest and virtually suggest? I don't know what the difference is. Just get rid of the word fucking virtually. Times he suggested the Blacks were intellectually inferior to whites by nature. It's true. In the end, he left it to science to determine whether nature or environment was responsible for what he perceived to be a distressing absence of intellectual accomplishment among Blacks, especially in the arts of sciences. And they quote him, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only." Plaudits to the editors of PUP, Princeton University Press, for including that. He doesn't know. He's very tugged in the direction of nature. But in the end, he says, I just don't know. There are problems with that view as well. I advance it as suspicion only. The Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. And they say Benjamin Banneker was the first and only Black man to challenge Jefferson's suspicion directly in his lifetime. I think that's correct also. Banneker, from what we know, was an extraordinary human being. So, I mean, I just leave it with that.
When I would, before we get to the fifth question, the only thing I would add is, and you and I talked about this off the show as well, is that there's that famous quote where he talks about Sir Isaac Newton, who was obviously one of the most brilliant human beings in the history of recorded history. I should say in recorded history. And he basically says that, Sir Isaac Newton, just because he was highly intelligent, is not the lord of body and mind over others. He doesn't get to enslave the world because of it.
Yeah, a lot of highly intelligent people are complete assholes when it comes down to it. In terms of morally functioning beings, they lack moral discernment to a large degree. I mean, you think about it, putting your intellect at work at specific problems to the exclusion of other things means you fail to live as a full human being. So it's we've got the saying of a lot of people who call them idiot savants, that they're so brilliant in terms of what they do on one thing that they don't really live in the world like regular people. So I don't think Jefferson was one of those.
No.
But yeah, very good point, Captain, that the Isaac Newton quote is a very good addition.
So question 5, what does Thomas Jefferson elsewhere say? I think you have some material on that.
Yeah, you want to read the quote? Do you have the quote from Condorcet that I have right here?
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson to Condorcet, August 30th, 1791. I am happy to be able to inform you that we have now in the United States a Negro, the son of a Black man born in Africa and of a Black woman born in the United States, who is a very respectable mathematician. I procured him to be employed under one of our chief directors in laying out the new federal city on the Potomac. And in the intervals of his leisure while on that work, he made an almanac.
The White House, right? He was helped designing not just the White House, but I mean the whole city itself. He was on
the whole city. It's all the streets. He made an almanac for the next year, which he sent me in his own handwriting, and which I enclose to you. I have seen very, very elegant solutions of geometrical problems by him. Add to this that he is a very worthy and respectable member of society. He is a free man. I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the want of talents observed in them is merely the effect of their degraded condition and not proceeding from any difference in the structure of the parts on which the intellect depends.
Yeah, so it's a very, he promised to send the almanac to his friend Condorcet. Condorcet was an avid abolitionist, and Jefferson follows through his promise. And I said he was a freed slave. He wasn't. He was a free man all of his life. His parents were freed slaves and so forth. So you corrected me on that. So we have this other letter to Barlow. Do you want to read that as well?
Yeah.
This creates problems. This creates
October
problems.
8th, 1809. A day or two after I received your letter to Bishop Gregoire, a copy of his diatribe to you came to hand from France. I had not before heard of it. He must have been eagle-eyed in quest of offense to have discovered ground for it among the rubbish massed together. In the print, he adverts on you have done right in giving him a sugary answer, but he did not deserve it. For notwithstanding a compliment to you now and then, he constantly returns to the identification of your sentiments with the extravagancies of revolutionary zealots. I believe him a very good man, with imagination enough to declaim eloquently, but without judgment to decide. He wrote to me also on the doubts I had expressed 5 or 6 and 20 years ago in the Notes of Virginia, as to the grade of understanding of the Negroes, and he sent me his book on the literature of the Negroes. His credulity has made him gather up every store he could find of men of color, without distinguishing whether black or what degree of mixture, however slight the mention or light the authority on which they are quoted. The whole do not amount in point of evidence to what we know ourselves of Banneker. We know he had spherical trigonometry enough to make almanacs, but not without the suspicion of aid from Ellicott. George, an amateur astronomer, and Andrew, a writer of almanacs.
That's something I add.
Who was his neighbor and friend, and never missed an opportunity of puffing him. I have a long letter from Banneker, which shows him to have had a mind of very common stature indeed.
Okay, I'll stop you there for a second. Hold on. So right off the bat, we have Jefferson has some suspicions. Now, he thinks highly of Banneker. There's no question. He says that the one quote you said, Gregoire assumed, and I'll bring this up in a bit, he brought up a collection of writings, I think it's by 8 different African Americans of some degree of blackness, some pure black, some were mulattoes and so forth. And Jefferson criticized that right off the bat for not discriminating degree of blackness or degree of whiteness in the mulattoes and so forth. He says here that of all this collection of writings that Gregoire assembles, all of the whole thing pales in comparison to Banneker, his achievement with the almanac, even if he did have help. Now he talks about there was suspicion he had aid from Ellicott, and Ellicott, George, was an amateur astronomer. His brother Andrew was a writer of almanacs since 1787. I add that, did some research on that. And these, one of them, I think it was Andrew, was always trying to help out Benjamin. He recognized this was a man of high talent, high mathematical ability, and he was trying to help him out. So Jefferson is at least curious, did he had spherical trigonometry, and he certainly knows mathematics, but to what extent did he have help from Ellicott on the almanacs? Because Andrew was writing almanacs, for years before Banneker was. So he might have had help from Ellicott. Now, to what extent does that diminish Banneker's wonderful achievement in publishing? Finally, his work was not published for a long time, and it finally got published. All right, you can go to, unless you have something.
As to Bishop Gregoire, I wrote him, as you have done, a very soft answer. It was impossible for doubt to have been more tenderly or hesitatingly expressed than that was in the Notes of Virginia, and nothing was, or is farther from my intentions than to enlist myself as the champion of a fixed opinion where I have only expressed a doubt. Santo Domingo will in time throw light on this question.
San Domingo was an island that was where there's a great revolution of African Americans against the French, and to what extent Jefferson was sort of petrified by that whole event. Anyways, here is Banneker's picture of Banneker's almanac, right? And let me see if we have, here's a cover when it finally gets published, 1795. And you got a picture of an African American on the cover. Now, perhaps he had difficulties getting the almanac published, and probably had help from his white friends. And one could understand, because how many people are going to be interested in an almanac, put forth by a black person? Probably not a lot of white people are going to buy the thing. But it would be a matter of extraordinary interest for scientists across the world, at least, to see this young African American, successfully accomplishing, whether he was helped considerably by Ellicott or not. Still, this is an extraordinary accomplishment. I certainly couldn't do it.
Absolutely.
Like
I don't know if you could.
Huge Joe project. Friday, could you do this?
I couldn't do an almanac. No,
No,
you want me to write a a large in criminal investigation, I'll do that, but writing an almanac would be quite a challenge for me.
Yeah, I can write a book on Jefferson. I couldn't do an almanac. So it's a pretty, and Jefferson has his doubts about, because he says this is, I read his letter, and the letter is very ordinary. I read the letter, and it's, what I get is an ordinary letter. I don't know what he means by that. I mean, I think he's trying to say it doesn't show brilliance. But on the other hand, I would say one thing the letter shows, it bespeaks to me a sort of nervousness on Banneker. He's afraid to write to Jefferson because, he's probably written to a lot of people and everybody tells him to get fucked. So he's writing to Jefferson, what he repeats himself a lot. And it suggests to me some nervousness that here I am writing to someone of such eminence, Thomas Jefferson. He's probably, hopefully he'll be interested in helping the cause, my cause, as well as the cause of blacks, because he's had a reputation for wanting to end the institution of slavery. But what the letter suggests to me is not so much that it's an ordinary letter, maybe it is, but it's a nervous letter. And I don't blame him.
Writing to a great man.
Yeah, writing to a great man. And, there's a lot on the line for Banneker here. So it's an extraordinary accomplishment. So, I mean, you have anything to say here? So he's got to do all this stuff with the sun and moon.
No, I think it is quite an extraordinary accomplishment, and I do think, although Jefferson had his doubts, he still cordially and politely did what he said he was going to do. He forwarded it to Condorcet, and I think he did leave open, although he did lean towards nature. I really do think that he does not get due credit for being a man far ahead of his time in many ways, and also keeping an open mind at the end of the day. I think he did. I mean, it's evidenced by his letter to Barlow. He was a scientist by nature.
Yes, he was an empiricist and scientist, empiricist, philosopher, and scientist by nature. And scientists are always. It's funny because a lot of people try to say to be a Jefferson scholar, you need to know something about science. Because a lot of people read Jefferson's empirical bent in Notes on Virginia, where he's talking about this and he's amassing information, developing several different competing hypotheses, trying to test them, see which one is correct. And when he's talking about fossils in the upper parts of certain lower mountains, he comes up with 3 competing hypotheses, all of which he says are false. And a lot of people who a lot of scholars, some prominent scholars, say, this man's confused. He's not confused. He's doing frickin' science, for God's sakes.
Right.
If you have different hypotheses and you have a certain amount of evidence, and the evidence you have evidence that's not consistent with hypotheses, you can't say this hypothesis is true. Of course, if you're writing about Sally Hemings, you can, because no one cares about getting all the available evidence.
It doesn't matter.
I want to end on something that is, so here's the book by Gregoire, who collects, I think, 15 Negroes and mulattoes. I said 8, it's 15, where he talks about them. And Jefferson has a copy of this from Gregoire, and he doesn't think very much of it. He reads through it all, and he said, looking at the accomplishments here, one is if there is a difference by nature between, say, white and black, when the two mix together, you should notice an improvement in the offspring from the black perspective and a degradation from the white perspective. And he says, I read through all these, and we have Negroes and mulattoes. He doesn't distinguish between Negroes and mulattoes, so we can assess. And he says, but the whole compilation is really not impressive in the first place. He says, if you look at Banneker's almanac, this compilation pales in comparison to what Banneker has left behind, who's a person who is clearly of black descent and only of black descent. And he writes this pretty impressive almanac that eventually